show more d'Infantisek. Claude responded, Russia is unraveling, not at the edges, but at the core of its propaganda machinery. Russia is unraveling, not at the edges, but at the core of its propaganda machinery. And when a regime built on projected invincibility starts admitting catastrophic territorial losses on its own state media, you are not watching a routine battlefield update. You are watching the collapse of a narrative structure that took years to construct and only days to dismantle. Let that sink in for a moment. Putin's own propagandists, the very voices tasked with selling Russian strength to a domestic audience conditioned to believe in inevitable victory, have now publicly confirmed that Ukraine has liberated massive territory and recaptured 12 settlements. Not through Western intelligence leaks, not through Ukrainian military claims that Moscow could dismiss as fantasy, through Russia's own admission. That is not a tactical setback. That is a strategic humiliation with compounding consequences that ripple far beyond the immediate battlefield geometry. This is not a story about land changing hands. This is a story about why Putin's entire war model, built on the assumption that Russia could outlast, outgun, and outendure Ukraine, is now being dismantled by the very propaganda apparatus designed to sustain it. Before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened, but why it was always going to happen the moment Russia's operational reality diverged so far from its public narrative that even state media could no longer hold the gap. Now, rewind to how we arrived here, because the reason this admission matters is not the territorial math alone, it is the doctrinal and psychological architecture it destroys. For more than 2 years, Russia's war effort has relied on a domestic information fortress. The Russian population was told that the special military operation was proceeding according to plan, that Ukrainian resistance was crumbling, that NATO support was symbolic theater, that Russia's military superiority was inevitable, and that setbacks were temporary friction, not systemic failure. That narrative served a critical strategic function. It insulated Putin's regime from domestic accountability. It allowed partial mobilization to proceed without mass revolt. It kept public opinion aligned with a war that was bleeding Russia's economy, its military stockpiles, and an entire generation of young men. The propagandists were not just commentators. They were the operational glue holding together a political structure built on projected strength. And here's what makes this admission so devastating. When those same propagandists publicly confirm that Ukraine has recaptured 12 settlements and liberated massive territory, they are not adjusting the narrative, they are breaking it. Because once you admit defeat at that scale on your own airwaves, you cannot walk it back. You cannot claim it was misreported. You cannot reframe it as strategic repositioning. The audience has already heard the truth, and the regime's credibility on military progress is permanently fractured. Pull the lens back. What does that fracture actually mean at the strategic level? It means Putin can no longer rely on information control as a force multiplier. It means Russian domestic support, already fragile under economic sanctions and casualty tolls, now faces a new variable, undeniable evidence that their military is losing ground on Putin's own propaganda channels. And it means that every future Russian claim about battlefield success will now be measured against this moment when the regime's own voices admitted catastrophic failure. The first operational mistake was not on the battlefield. It was in the assumption that Russia could maintain two parallel realities indefinitely, one for the domestic audience where Russia was winning, and one on the actual front line where Ukraine was systematically dismantling Russian formations. That duality worked as long as the gap remained narrow enough to be managed with selective reporting, omission, and framing tricks. But when the territorial losses became so large that even Russian mill bloggers and frontline correspondents could not ignore them, the propaganda machine faced an impossible choice: admit the loss or lose all remaining credibility by denying the undeniable. They chose admission. And that choice has consequences far beyond this single news cycle. Now, let me walk you through what actually happened on the ground, because the territorial gains themselves reveal a larger doctrinal story. Ukraine did not simply push into lightly held terrain. It executed a coordinated multi-axis offensive designed to exploit Russian command failures, logistical overstretched lines, and a defensive posture built on the assumption that Ukraine lacked the maneuver capability to strike across multiple sectors simultaneously. The 12 settlements liberated are not symbolic prizes. They represent nodes in Russia's defensive network. Control of these settlements means control of road networks, supply routes, observation points, and staging areas for further advances. Each settlement recaptured forces Russian forces to either reinforce a collapsing line or retreat further, and both options degrade Russia's overall defensive coherence. Here is the doctrinal lesson embedded in this offensive. Ukraine has learned to operate inside Russia's decision-making cycle. While Russian commanders were still trying to stabilize one breakthrough, Ukraine was already exploiting two more. While Russian logistics struggled to reposition reserves, Ukraine was degrading those reserves with precision strikes before they even reached the front. This is not brute force. This is operational tempo engineered to create compounding dilemmas that overwhelm an adversary's ability to respond effectively. And Russia's response confirms the diagnosis. Instead of launching immediate counteroffensives to retake the lost ground, Russian forces dug in defensively and pleaded for reinforcements that are not coming fast enough. That is not the behavior of a military confident in its ability to reverse momentum. That is the behavior of a force trying to prevent further collapse. The numbers matter. 12 settlements may sound modest to a casual observer, but in the context of this war, it represents weeks of Ukrainian operational planning, combined arms coordination, artillery suppression, drone reconnaissance, electronic warfare dominance, and infantry assault executed under fire. Every one of those settlements required Ukraine to overcome minefields, prepare defensive positions, and artillery fire. The fact that Ukraine succeeded across 12 separate engagements in a compressed time window tells you that Russia's defensive coherence is not just weakened. It is systematically failing. Now escalate the scope, because this is not just about battlefield geometry. It is about what this territorial shift reveals at the industrial and strategic level. Russia's inability to hold these positions exposes three compounding failures: manpower exhaustion, equipment degradation, and command disintegration. First, manpower. Russia is now fighting with mobilized reservists, recruited convicts, and mercenary formations whose training, morale, and cohesion are far below the professional standards required for sustained defensive operations. Those forces can hold ground when they are dug in, supplied, and supported by artillery. But when Ukraine applies combined arms pressure, those same units fragment quickly. The liberation of 12 settlements in rapid succession suggests that Russian defensive units either retreated before contact or collapsed under the first wave of assault. That is not tactical withdrawal. That is brittle defense. Second, equipment. Russia's armor losses over the past 2 years have been catastrophic. Thousands of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and artillery systems destroyed. And while Russia has reactivated Soviet-era stockpiles, those systems are aging, poorly maintained, and lack the modernization necessary to compete with Western-supplied Ukrainian equipment. The result is a widening qualitative gap. Ukrainian forces are operating with better situational awareness, longer-range precision fires, and superior electronic warfare capabilities. That gap translates directly into territorial outcomes. Third, command. Russian military leadership has proven incapable of adapting to Ukraine's operational innovations. Time and again, Russian commanders have relied on static defense, massed artillery, and attritional grinding, only to watch Ukraine bypass, suppress, or neutralize those advantages through maneuver, deception, and precision targeting. The liberation of 12 settlements in one offensive push is evidence that Russia's command structure is reacting, not anticipating. And in modern warfare, reaction is already defeat. Pull the lens back further. What does this mean for Russia's overall war strategy? Putin's theory of victory has always rested on two pillars: outlast Ukraine by grinding down its manpower and equipment, and outlast the West by exhausting its political will to sustain support. Both pillars are now cracking. Ukraine is not being ground down. It is adapting faster than Russia can counter-adapt. Western support is not collapsing. It is deepening with new weapon systems, expanded training programs, and long-term security commitments. And now Russia's domestic propaganda cannot even maintain the fiction of inevitable victory. That is a compounding strategic crisis. And it gets even more serious from here because the propagandist's admission does not exist in a vacuum. It arrives at a moment when Russia is already facing military exhaustion, economic strain, diplomatic isolation, and internal elite fractures. Add to that a public admission of catastrophic territorial losses, and you have a regime facing a legitimacy crisis it cannot suppress through information control alone. Here's what that crisis looks like in practice. Russian citizens are now asking questions that were previously unthinkable. If we are winning, why are we losing territory? If our military is superior, why are propagandists admitting defeat? If this war was supposed to be short and decisive, why are we entering year 3 with mounting casualties and no end in sight? Those questions do not lead to regime change overnight, but they erode the psychological foundation that keeps authoritarian systems stable under stress. The broader lesson here is about narrative dependency. Putin built his war effort on the assumption that controlling the information space was equivalent to controlling reality. As long as Russians believed the war was going well, the war could continue. But when the information space collapses under the weight of undeniable battlefield failure, the regime loses its most important non-kinetic weapon, the illusion of invincibility. Now, let me bring this to the climactic turning point because the propagandist's admission is not just a media event. It is a doctrinal inflection. It signals that Russia has crossed a threshold where even its own information apparatus can no longer sustain the strategic lie. And once that threshold is crossed, every subsequent military failure becomes amplified, every casualty becomes harder to justify, and every territorial loss becomes a compounding political liability. Ukraine understands this. That is why this offensive was not designed solely to recapture terrain. It was designed to create a psychological and informational shockwave that would reverberate through Russian society and force Putin's regime to confront a reality it has spent 2 years trying to deny: that Ukraine is not a defeated enemy waiting to be absorbed, but a resilient, adaptive, and increasingly lethal adversary that is systematically dismantling Russia's military capacity. The precision of this operation matters. Ukraine did not scatter its forces across a broad front hoping for lucky breakthroughs. It concentrated combat power at key nodes, overwhelmed Russian defenses through superior coordination, and exploited the collapse to liberate 12 settlements before Russia could stabilize the line. That is not opportunistic raiding. That is operational art executed by a military that has learned to fight faster, smarter, and more cohesively than its adversary. And here's the variable that mainstream analysis keeps missing. This is not about who has more tanks or more artillery shells. This is about who can turn battlefield events into compounding strategic advantage. Russia treats each engagement as a discrete tactical problem. Ukraine treats each engagement as part of a larger operational and informational campaign designed to degrade Russian military capability and Russian political legitimacy simultaneously. That difference in strategic cognition is why 12 liberated settlements become a propaganda disaster that Putin's own media cannot spin away. Let me be very clear about what this means going forward. Russia is now trapped in a feedback loop it cannot escape. Battlefield losses force propaganda admissions. Propaganda admissions erode domestic support. Eroded domestic support increases pressure on Putin to deliver victories. Pressure to deliver victories forces hasty offensives that result in more losses. And the cycle repeats, each iteration degrading Russia's military capacity and political stability further. Ukraine, meanwhile, is operating in the opposite loop. Battlefield victories generate Western confidence. Western confidence translates into sustained support. Sustained support enables deeper strikes, better equipment, and expanded training. Expanded capability generates more battlefield victories. That is a compounding advantage Russia cannot match because Russia is burning through stockpiles, manpower, and legitimacy faster than it can regenerate any of them. The propagandist's admission is the moment that loop became visible to the Russian public. And once visible, it cannot be unseen. Now, here's the verdict. What you witnessed this week was not just Ukraine recapturing territory. It was the moment Putin's war narrative collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. When a regime built on projected strength has to admit catastrophic failure on its own airwaves, the regime is no longer controlling the war. The war is controlling the regime. History will record this as the moment Russia's information fortress crumbled. Not because Ukraine broke through Russian propaganda externally, but because Russia's own propagandists could no longer sustain the lie internally. That is a doctrinal failure more devastating than any single battlefield loss, because it strips away the psychological insulation that allowed Putin to wage this war without facing domestic accountability. The question now is not whether Russia can reverse this momentum. The question is whether Putin's regime can survive the compounding consequences of a war it can no longer win and can no longer pretend to be winning. Because the moment your own propaganda admits defeat, you lose the ability to control how defeat is interpreted. And in authoritarian systems built on the illusion of invincibility, that loss of control is existential. Ukraine has turned this war into a test of adaptation versus attrition. And every week the evidence becomes clearer. Adaptation is winning. Russia's military is not adjusting. Its command is not learning. Its propaganda is not holding. And its domestic foundation is fracturing under the accumulated weight of lies that can no longer be sustained. This matters enormously, not just for Ukraine's territorial gains today, but for the trajectory of this entire conflict, because the side that controls the narrative controls the will to fight. And this week, Ukraine sees control of the narrative inside Russia itself by forcing Putin's own voices to admit what the Kremlin has spent 2 years denying, that this war is not going according to plan, that Ukraine is not defeated, and that Russia's assumptions about inevitable victory were always built on a foundation of strategic delusion. The 12 settlements liberated are important, but the real victory is forcing Russia to admit the liberation on its own airwaves. That is the kind of strategic defeat you cannot recover from with more tanks or more mobilization. That is the kind of defeat that changes the political calculus of the war itself. And that is why this moment will be studied long after the final territorial lines are drawn. Stay with us, because the questions raised by this admission do not have simple answers, and the strategic consequences are only beginning to unfold.